Okay, Cindy, what are my opportunities to increase sales for snacks in North America?
Analyzing sales for snacks in North America.
Meet Cindy, a first-of-its-kind artificial intelligence-enabled digital assistant for grocery and hard goods suppliers and retailers that transforms the way you work.
Sales in North America are $398 million, up by 0.3%. However, chocolate-based snacks are outperforming the category.
Cindy processes billions of bits of data in real time, mining trends and anomalies to serve up answers in seconds that would take a team of analysts hours, days, or even weeks. In short, Cindy does what is humanly impossible, revealing hidden insights and recommending intelligent business decisions that drive profitable revenue growth and customer loyalty. So the next time you need fast answers and actionable recommendations, why not ask Cindy and have a conversation that matters? Thanks, Cindy.
You're welcome.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 4 of the Trade Squad. We've got Barry McGeough here with us. Why don't you tell us who you are and what you're doing with us today?
Hi. Look, thanks for having me today. Really excited to be on the podcast. I'm Barry McGeough, former founder of Innovation Next at PVH, and running innovation projects for some companies that I'm super excited to work with. One of which includes my work at Google, which is very interesting, and really looking at the future of innovation and really operationalizing the idea of bringing new ideas into enterprises across the value chain.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, we are so excited to have you here. We have a jam-packed episode with lots of great content, but we're going to start off with the first topic, which is Africa. A couple of months ago, or maybe about a month and a half ago, I had a guest blog post by Megan Malone all about Africa being an emerging market. And I know you have some experience with that, Barry. And I know that Leah and Audrey have also looked into this as well. So why don't we get started talking about that? Is Africa an emerging market? And what do we think? Who wants to go first? Don't all go at once.
So I can. Yeah. Sorry. So as a market, it's not something that I can look at specifically from a brand perspective, but certainly the apparel industry is very well focused on looking at Africa as an emerging source territory, especially with the competitive advantage around AGOA. The North Africa area is very appealing for us, and so. Large companies like PVH and like VF have worked on improving their supply chains in the Ethiopia area to great effect, and looking at doing it in interesting ways, not just saying, is this a low labor cost area for us, but how can we do it differently from a CR and sustainability perspective that we can set up long-term sustainable supply chains in the North Africa region.
Yeah, so and I think...
Very interesting area for us on the sourcing side.
Yeah, and I think it's a really important topic as well, because I know as not only from that perspective, but also an emerging market, like the demographics coming out of there are amazing. It's from some of my research, it says it's the fastest growth e-commerce market in the world, and they are very brand loyal and they love luxury items. So I think that we have to take a look at them as, another market. So for example, if I'm a Canadian company or a US company looking to go global, I think that Africa should definitely be on the list, don't you think?
I really like what Puma's done. And I had, when you think about what they're doing on the footwear side, they've focused very much on the African football leagues. And they are the brand of record for athletic footwear, knocking out Nike and Adidas to be the most prominent brand in Africa. So I think you're absolutely right. When you focus on those markets, they will definitely focus right back at you as a brand.
Absolutely. What's your experience, Audrey?
Yeah, for sure. It's certainly becoming a bigger and bigger player. I think as they have developed some extensive infrastructure developments in kind of all over the region. that infrastructure development is certainly leading to the ability of more and more consumers to participate in the market. So certainly from a consumer growth standpoint, those demographics are huge. And it's also, my understanding is that it's there's a lot of kind of the demographic areas between sort of the 15-year-old to 45-year-old is a huge amount of consumers. So that's great for most businesses, especially with those brand names and luxury houses.
Yeah, I think that, within Africa, of course, we have a lot of nations, some more advanced than others. And so I think there's a, misperception of categorizing all of Africa in a certain way. It has elements that are emerging, most definitely. But I think the China Belt and Road Initiative is an exciting example of how these partnerships are really leveraging what's taking place in Africa. I know areas like South Africa are hubs for new technologies. And I think that e-commerce most definitely is a really exciting play into the Africa market. So lots of potential, certainly one of the largest growing consumer markets, as you mentioned. And I think it's a market that small business in particular should take a look at and really consider.
I think there's 1 billion people on the continent. I mean, I think one statistic I saw recently with their middle class is over 350 million. So that's the middle class in Africa is the population of the United States. So
Wow.
Not to be ignored as a consumer market.
Yeah.
Absolutely. How can you ignore that kind of a number?
Yeah.
Certainly, as an exporter, as a shipper, though, you do have to do your research. Like as Leah says, it's not like Africa, the continent, is everybody does the same thing.
Right.
It's very much in individual regions. There's regional blocks. There's certain areas like just from kind of geography, like in the north is kind of that kind of desert climate, so that's kind of a whole different aspect of Africa. You've got just a variety of climates, nations, people, demographics. So if you're thinking as a shipper or exporter of going, you really have to narrow down into what specific country you're looking at,
Yeah.
and then really do your research from there.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really great
I
point.
think for sure there's considerations throughout Africa that are particularly important from a political risk standpoint, from currency valuations. So you're absolutely right. Exciting potential there, but be very specific. And for the big players like South Africa that are well positioned to, be a partner in this, I think tremendous excitement, a lot of potential. But yeah, I still get lovely spam letters from supposed princes and kings in Africa to, share my bank account. So there's entrepreneurs over there of every stripe, and not all are good for business. But yeah.
Well, I think we, one last point on that. I think we also have to take a look at culture, right? Because the culture is going to change from region to region in Africa. And depending on where you're going to spend the most of your time or take a look at, a specific region, you also need to know what that culture is like. And one of the stats said they're brand loyal, but is that all of Africa? Is that just a portion of Africa? And what does that mean for you? What are they looking for on specific products? How do they do business? Right? Is it a handshake? Is it, there's so many different nuances that you need to know when you're going to do business in different countries. So just a final point on that. Anybody else?
It's certainly exciting to see the trade economic partnership coming together, though. It really shows some thoughtfulness in how they're approaching global trade.
Absolutely. It's an exciting time. It's going to be exciting to watch, I think, and a huge market to tap into. All right. So the next question is digital trade. I think this one is Leah. Is that right?
Yes.
All right. And it's we want to talk about, do we need trade policy on digital trade? So I'll throw that over to you to get started.
Oh, yes. We absolutely need to take a look at our trade agreements. I think the U.S. Canada-Mexico agreement is a perfect example. That agreement was, I think, over 20 years old and certainly did not include within it, policy related to digital transfer of data, et cetera. So incredibly important. And I think the GDR, which we talked about previously, the EU's policy around data protection, was really at the forefront of leading this discussion. But it's something that businesses across the board need to be cognizant of. I think oftentimes we don't think about entry into foreign markets, and China is a great example, beyond potential IP theft, et cetera. There's not necessarily an exchange of that data. So you may have a consumer base over there that you don't really get to identify in any detail because that data is not available to you. So data policy is, I think, the new frontier. And I think the challenge will be, do we have the right people at the table in these discussions who really understand the ramifications and are looking forward to determine what this is going to evolve into as much as possible up ahead? Because more and more, business transactions are taking place online.
Absolutely. And maybe I should. So when I was doing my research, I came across an explanation of what digital trade is. So it said digital trade includes end products such as downloaded movies and products and services that rely on or facilitate digital trade, such as productivity enhancing tools like cloud data storage and email. So I don't know if that really answers the question as to what digital trade is and what we should look at for trade policy, but this is a huge, huge, huge conversation.
And it's problematic because the World Trade Organization is trying to wrap their arms around this. But of course, every country has different capabilities and different understandings. So you may be able to have access via an e-commerce platform into Indonesia, and then find out that there are restrictions in terms of the types of online advertising you can do. So from every potential angle, there are different interpretations within each country. I think at the end of the day, for me, what's most critical is understanding how we protect and are responsible stewards of our consumers' data. I mean, as business, we're going to operate in another country. Are we really protecting that data as much as possible? And so then, of course, that threads into the cybersecurity side of things as well.
Leah, do you think that Silicon Valley is sufficiently represented on Capitol Hill in terms of the real point of view that needs to happen when it comes to data and data transfer?
That's a really interesting discussion, and without delving into a potential conspiracy theory, I know that there are hesitations in terms of how transparent some of those Silicon Valley tech leaders are truly being in these discussions. I know with Google as an example, certainly they're a leading platform, if not the leading platform, and there are challenges in terms of their interpretation, meaning Google, of good stewardship versus that of the government. And then there becomes a gray area in terms of, in the government's effort to protect its citizens, and China's a great example of this, are we now handing over that data to the government? And indeed we are. I know here in California, actually this is, I believe, nationally, the DMV, it was just discovered, does indeed share your data. And that's something that's not necessarily known to consumers. Now, it doesn't mean that they share it in the same way that, Amazon or an online seller might. But I think you're absolutely right, Barry. I don't know that we have the right folks at the table. And who is at the table? Can we truly be assured, that there's not some self-interest there?
I think we also worry when we see Facebook being hauled up to Capitol Hill that senators are not asking the right questions, that this is an area, and we'll talk a little bit about these ideas of exponential technologies, but this is a sort of an exponential area of growth that is moved forward in such a swift way that the digital fluency, the language that's required to talk about privacy or data or what data means, it feels like the right questions aren't being asked. And if there was some primer that could happen on Capitol Hill to give a little pill of information to ask the right questions, it feels like in a lot of respects the right questions aren't being asked from a legislative perspective.
I totally agree with that. And I also think it's interesting because while I'm not an advocate for the diplomacy of the current administration, I do think there's maybe something within this idea of individual trade agreements, because it may be that it's an archaic notion that these kind of large agreements will suffice over multiple years, because technology has just evidence that this is something we'll have to likely revisit regularly.
Yeah.
And that from a policy and governance standpoint is very challenging. But if we really want to stay on top of that, to your point, Barry, and I think that Facebook example was sort of a glaring example of how disconnected policy leadership is from the realities of technology.
So I can share a little bit. Last summer, we were fortunate enough to be able to do a top-to-top meeting with Alibaba, Tencent, and Baidu. And we really found what was quite interesting is that these are three mega platforms that are operating in Asia. And there's a fantastic New York Times video piece. It's on YouTube. It says it's called "How China is Changing Your Internet," and I would highly recommend that anybody watch it. It's 3 minutes of you'll really understand these ideas of mega platforms and how everything is rolled up into one experience where you never leave the app. But essentially, if you're never leaving the app to do anything, to look at a LinkedIn or to type profile or to go onto a YouTube type website or to transact or pay or transact in a social environment, you understand that these large companies are gaining tremendous amounts of data about what you're doing and when you're online and also when you're offline and what you're saying about other people. And this is, when we talked to Tencent, they had a very interesting point of view. And they said, look, we have all these cameras everywhere. And the cameras are really about identifying where missing people are, missing persons, missing children. And they were really proud of it. And they said that for hundreds of thousands or even millions of cameras that they have all over China, that they've actually rescued and reunited a couple of dozen people.
Wow.
We thought that was super interesting because that's a really low number considering the amount of surveillance. And so what they kind of justify this as this great thing that they're being able to do. But on the other hand, they said we're aggregating so much data, and this is on the Tencent side, that they're putting it in a nuclear-proof vault in a mountain that they purchased.
Really?
And this is really a kind of a shocking confession and really interesting because most private companies can't buy mountains or nuclear-proof vaults.
Right. So what are they doing with it?
Some large countries can.
Yeah.
And so the idea that the Chinese government is very well invested in the aggregation of data and using it for social engineering is quite clear and quite a powerful idea, because when we think about these ideas of GDPR and we think of our sort of almost naive notions of privacy, and I say they're naive because I've never opted out of anyone that said, hey, we're going to take all this data, click yes or no to get this free app. I always say yes. And of course, we are a bit naive when it comes to privacy. We have this illusion of privacy. We give it away for free. What's happening in China is quite powerful. We don't really quite understand. And we don't understand these ideas of these mega entities like a WeChat and what WeChat Pay means or Alipay means. And what it means to commerce. Right. What it means we're actually buying into the idea of social pay or user-generated commerce. These are very, very big ideas that are changing the way product is going to market, all based on data. And that's when I ask the question: Are we from a legislative point of view? Are we asking the right questions of our leaders with a U.S.-centric view of how data can be used and how exponentially it's being used in other countries?
Well, I'm going to throw some stats in here, and then I'm going to talk about another sort of component to this for us to sort of think about. So in my research, what it said was that the internet is the equivalent of the 5th largest national economy. And the digital economy accounted for 6.9% of current dollar gross U.S. domestic product in 2017. Those are really big numbers. And I think that it's pertinent to not only supply chains, but commerce, e-commerce, consumers, for everybody, for us to get this right. And so the other thing that I'm going to throw in here is that what if it lifts the boundaries? If we can bring digital trade into trade policy and it can lift the boundaries. And what do I mean by that? Well, I mean that for me in Canada, I look at different things on the internet and with different companies than you do in the States. And one example that I can tell you is iTunes. So I look at iTunes for the podcast and I get reviews on iTunes, and I can only see Canadian reviews. I have to go on to different websites for different countries to be able to see those countries' reviews. And I would hope that if we're able to put digital trade into and we get it right into trade policy, that I'd be able to see the same things that somebody in Indonesia would be able to see, or somebody in Europe would be able to see. Right? Do you think that it's going to break down those boundaries or what?
My initial reaction is no, just because I think, like with, with a lot of trade policy, it's not universally quid pro quo. And that's the unfortunate thing. There's protectionist stances built into a lot of these trade agreements. And I think partly because leadership is not necessarily well informed around the technology, that will be an initial reaction is, well, we're not going to share our data, or we're not going to let you come in. And also, we don't understand all of the potential from a security standpoint, and I think that hasn't been addressed. And so that should sit alongside our tech approach to policy, and I don't think we're there yet. So I think there are a lot of real concerns, and we're already well behind the 8 ball on this.
Do you think that we could get there, though? You don't think that trade policy and us bringing some regulation around it would maybe help with that part of it?
But it depends on your viewpoint, right? I mean, Canada's been leading the charge of inserting these kind of digital trade policy chapters into our agreements, from CETA, the comprehensive trade agreement we have with Europe, to trying to, when we were doing the update on NAFTA with the US, and then in the CTTPP agreement, Canada's been pushing for this, digital trade policy, but Canada at the same time has very strict rules on Canadian content and on our privacy. So, as much as we're like, yeah, let's get together on this digital trade policy, like, is it only from Canada's perspective and in Canada's best interest?
Right.
Because we are very, very strict on it. And it's a push from, we only have maybe, we don't have that many media companies. So let's say there's 4 or 5. Like, in Canada, you run into these monopolies, right? So they're pushing for very different things. They don't want some, I guess it's this fear. Nobody wants the bigger place to take over their market or their citizens, right? So for the historic perspective for Canada has always been, we want to avoid having this tsunami of American culture, just wipe out our culture, wipe out our businesses or experience. And I think for the Americans, we don't want China to wipe out, and take over our digital privacy and our digital. And Europe's just like, completely all over this privacy, like everything should be private. And you're like, that's so unrealistic. But, I think we all have such different viewpoints that it is really like, how are we going to come together and agree on this? So yeah, and if you see how well we agree on so many other things as a unified world.
Are we ever going to have, I'm coining this, freedom of global digital information? Yes or no?
That before or after we dismantle the WTO? In like the next 6 months.
Yeah.
Well, no,
yeah,
wait.
I think
before that, we have to dismantle the small parcel association, right? Which is happening in 3 weeks.
In 3 weeks. Yeah. I think so. I think there'll be, even maybe in 5 years, people will realize it just, it might be more effective to come together on some things, whether we fully agree or not. But.
Well, Leah does not agree with you.
It's never going to happen.
I want to believe that. I think we're going to see in the elections here in the U.S. very soon a greater use of manipulation through data around sentiments on our elections. And I think that's the perfect example of where we part ways in terms of use of online platforms and data and how it can be abused. So,
Barry, do you have any last comments on that before I turn it over to you?
Well, certainly what comes to mind when you're talking about full transparency is from an e-commerce perspective, there are so many aspects of markets, how different brands go to markets, Forex restrictions or changes, that it would be very interesting to see this sort of free flow of information across the internet, which is how I don't know if it's how DARPA envisioned the internet, but certainly this a pure engineer's point of view of what the Silicon Valley view of what the internet would be. It certainly has changed a lot since DARPANet.
And
we'll see where we take it from here rather.
Leah, do you think though, we talked about digital currency on our last episode and Libra. I mean, with something like that comes in and just everyone just might find something like that so convenient that it's like governments can't even stop that wave of everybody wants to use this. So
no, I mean, I definitely look, I want to be the utopian champion as well. I just know that for every great element of this, open data, there's also a side that is money laundering. It's being used for nefarious purposes. And certainly there's a truth there that we can't avoid everything and all of that and make it a perfect solution. But I do think some of these issues are so big that it would take a lot to get us to a place of perfect unity on this.
Well, and I also wonder, who really knows, like who can really champion this and make sure it's done right? Because do we really have anybody that in that kind of position that really knows?
We're going to build a robot, and
Xi Jinping thinks he knows.
Sorry, Barry?
Xi Jinping thinks he knows.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we're going to get to the next one. And so this is over to Barry. I know that you wanted to talk about the collision of exponential technologies like data, AI, and the effect on the consumer. And I thought this was an interesting topic because for me, in retail, it's come up, like customization, personalization has come up a lot. So I think this is going to be a huge topic moving forward in not only supply chains, but in retail. So I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks. No, I appreciate it. So feel like there's this conversation that we're starting to have from a business perspective and from an innovation perspective. And that's really the contextualization of what's happening with these very big ideas and what we refer to as exponential technologies. So there's a huge component that's happening right now. If you look at e-commerce platforms specifically on what's happening with machine learning, can these omni-channel environments that we're trying to create learn from what consumers are doing and how they're transacting, and how can that experience be improved in terms of everything from customer interaction efficiency to logistics to consumer satisfaction. And so a great example of what's happening in this area would be Stitch Fix. We look at and again, just focusing on the apparel and footwear industry, we look at our business as relatively Cro-Magnon in its way, that we would go in and we would make a thing and we would sell a thing. And we're really learning how to function on these e-commerce platforms more efficiently. But if you look at a company like Stitch Fix, and right now they're valued at about $600 or $700 million right now, and growing quite quickly. They're one of the fastest growing apparel companies in the apparel space. And what they've done is they've said, we're going to use machine learning and we're going to use algorithms to improve the experience that an end consumer will have. So if you're familiar with the Stitch Fix model, they will send you, it's a subscription service, they'll send you a box of apparel. You'll get 5 things, and they'll incent you to buy everything in the box. But you only get that box after you have a consultancy. And someone says, okay, well, what's your style? Let's say I'm a little bit country and I'm a little bit rock and roll. So they'll send me some things that may fit that profile. But if they send me a cowboy hat and I return it, then they'll never send me a cowboy hat again, because they're applying machine learning to say, how can we get to the best efficiency level possible to make sure that you love everything in that box and you buy everything in the box. So by applying machine learning, they're learning about you as this single, unique snowflake customer. Who am I? Who am I, this little bit country, little bit rock and roll guy, and make sure that I get everything they want, so that when they're transacting at 100%. They're not sending anything back. They're not like Amazon Prime Wardrobe that's saying, well, the way we're going to solve this inefficiency in customer satisfaction with how clothes fit or how clothes look on me is that they'll just send you 10 things and you can send them all back. Most people don't have those logistics economies of scale. So they're using data. They're using data to know you as that end consumer. And so increasingly what's going to happen with something like AI or machine learning, that end consumers will expect that you know me, you know my own personal body, you know who I am, you know how this is going to fit me, you know my style. And increasingly in this idea around data and maybe using the sort of China mega platform that I was mentioning earlier, that if you know a brand, then you might be frustrated that the brand doesn't know you back.
Right.
I know a brand called Ralph Lauren. Ralph, why don't you know me? And you actually become frustrated, right? In the same
Ralph.
way that you say, yeah, Ralph. I don't know Ralph personally, but so this idea that these exponential technologies are coming down very quickly, that they're changing the expectations of end consumers. And we're really looking at mega platforms trying to figure out how to do something about this. So Amazon's recent acquisition of Body Labs was very interesting. Body Labs is a company that will use your phone to use a sophisticated camera and do point-to-point detection to take a picture of yourself with a camera and know your body. Now, body morphology is a really big deal as body shapes change and grow, and they're geographically also quite different. There's hundreds of thousands of different kinds of body morphotypes. So what they're doing is they're saying they purchase Body Labs to try to figure out how to take a picture of your own human body. And when you get that shirt, when you get that pair of underwear, when you get those intimates, they're gonna fit you perfectly. You're gonna be really satisfied with the Amazon product that you're purchasing.
Right.
So as Amazon starts to go into their own branded product in the apparel space, they're looking to increase that consumer satisfaction with the use of technology.
Yeah, and I think that when consumers learn more and more about data and what that data can actually do, they're going to expect that from the companies that they buy from. Right? It's not that, we're hiding data. Data, we're talking about data all the time. We're talking about it in supply chain. We're talking about it in accounting. We're talking about it in all sorts of different parts of a business where we're all consumers. And so we all know what's possible. And so we're going to start expecting that from the retailers that we purchase from.
And brands.
Right?
So the interesting thing for us is that we start to think about from an innovation perspective, because innovation has really grown a lot. The idea, and I can really speak to the apparel space, not necessarily what's happening in mobility or what's happening in pharmaceuticals, where these are industries that are very well sophisticated and they spend huge percentages of their revenue back on R&D. That's relatively new for us. And so our ideas around innovation were very similar to what Stephen Hill from KPMG referred to as a sort of pet rock thinking. If I'm going to build an innovation engine, I'm going to say, what's the next new thing that you're going to give me that's going to kick my business can down the road? So his philosophy is completely different. He says, look, if innovation is really going to work, you're going to have, and he feels that innovation is on what he calls an S curve, where we're moving from pet rock thinking and we're moving all the way up to this idea that innovation moves out to a forecasting and a foresight model, where we're looking at weak signals in society and we're asking ourselves, what are these things that are happening that are maybe a little bit farther out that could either disrupt our current business or could provide opportunities for new growth and new business models?
Right.
So we love to see the idea of the sophistication of the innovation engine, knowing that the pet rocks will come. If you can identify from a business strategy point of view that these things could be interesting to my enterprise, then you can future-proof yourself. And you can also figure out what could happen. So the interaction between exponential technologies and foresight is very close. So by way of example, I'm very interested right now in this idea around what's happening with 5G. So 5G is something from an end consumer's perspective that we think about and we think, oh, okay, well, we're just going to get a faster movie. Instead of taking 3 minutes to download a Netflix movie, we can do it in 15 seconds, and we can download, all the Marvel movies that we can imagine. So that's great. We're going to get faster connectivity speeds. But the way it works is it's using this massive in, massive out beamforming technology that will allow a tremendous transfer of data in ways that we can't even imagine will enable things to happen in real time. So recently I was up at Microsoft and their innovation center, and they had a medical dummy. It was the torso of a dummy, and you could go in endoscopically and put in a camera, and you could not an X-ray. No, who can read an X-ray, right? It's all black and white and blurry. But this is a 3D image of a heart, and it was you could put an endoscope down the throat of this dummy, and you could imagine you could go in an emergency room and start to look at someone who had heart failure, let's say congestive heart failure. Now, the interesting thing in this demonstration, by using all these great technologies of 3D imaging and being able to get in there inside the human body, was that when you put the scope down the throat of this dummy, there was a lag time. And so what would happen is you'd put the scope down, and then a few seconds later, the endoscope would touch the heart. Now, in real time, that patient just died.
Right.
But if in a 5G world, that everything's happening in real time because there's no data lag. Stuff isn't happening all the way to the cloud and back again. It's happening on the edge in real time. So when you have edge computing at the 5G level, then people can be doing reconstructive surgery when they're in their office in Boston on someone in Kenya.
My shout out or our call out to people with this digital trade and trade policy to say, hey, 5G is coming. It's going to move even faster than it is right now. Don't you think we should have these conversations and make sure we get this right?
Absolutely. And there will be completely different industries that will be spawned and born from 5G. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that I really loved was Kevin Kelly's article in Wired magazine, and he's the editor of Wired magazine. He wrote something called "Welcome to the Mirror World," and what he basically postulates is that on the physical layer of everything that we experience now, there will be a digital layer. So for instance, right now, you can go into a Lowe's department store and you can follow the purple line to a light bulb. And you can find the light bulbs, and it's wayfinding in mega stores. That's fantastic. You can start to look on your phone right now and look on Waze and figure out a way to get someplace. But what he's imagining is this will happen in real time. It only happened with 5G. When data can happen in real time, then this digital layer will be laid on top of the physical layer of the world. So for instance, you could walk down the street.
Right? Are we talking avatars?
It would be like Blade Runner 2050.
Yeah.
Or augmented reality.
But in real time. And that makes it very different. So you could walk down the street and you could find your favorite Italian restaurant. So the example that he puts forward is you can walk up to that restaurant and you can use your phone or your Magic Leap glasses, and you can say, okay, well, there's a table at 8:15. They're known for their spaghetti bolognese. They got 4 stars on Yelp, or they got 2 stars on Yelp, and you're not going to go there. So the question is, who owns the physical property of that store? Is it the restaurant owner? Is it the city of Santa Barbara where I live? Is it the property owner of that property? Mm-hmm. So who owns that property, and who can control the data that happens when it's broadcast in real time, right?
Yeah.
I think so. Yeah. And there's a dystopian view of that as well, which is for public spaces. So imagine right now you can use your phone to put Pokemon on the Eiffel Tower, or see Pokemon on the Eiffel Tower. Super cute. But what if someone decides to put a swastika on the Eiffel Tower?
Right.
Who owns that property? So is it the government? So there will be property rights, there will be ownership, there will be legislation that has to go into legislating the mirror world, and there'll be opportunities that'll come from the mirror world as well.
This kind of sounds like the scooter issue that you have over in Long Beach, right, Leah?
No, I was going to say I love the scooters, but yeah, in some parts of Southern California, there is a whole contingent that is vehemently against the scooters. I know in Santa Monica, if you're on a scooter, it will stop as you enter certain neighborhoods and you can't proceed. And that comes from community groups that came together. There was an article in the LA Times. One of the groups in Beverly Hills, the woman leading that community group said, a scooter left on the sidewalk in her neighborhood was the equivalent of leaving a handgun
I read that.
on the sidewalk. So there definitely is fear. I don't think all of that fear is entirely misplaced. I think social engineering comes down to a really big ethical question that comes out of all of these advances in technology. And I think it threads back to that other conversation around how the government is preparing for this.
Yeah.
You know, I look at our small business policy right now, and the way we identify success with assistance to small business is looking, one of the metrics is looking at if we've increased employment opportunities, which really is the complete opposite of trying to increase efficiencies. So if in government we're saying, hey, you hired more people, that's great for the economy and jobs, and therefore we must be doing something right. And simultaneously, business is looking for ways to reduce employment and be more efficient. What does that interpretation mean? I think it's sort of a good example of how far we are from government policy leading that discussion.
Yeah, and I'm gonna just step in there on the humans working with machines, because I think when we're talking about bringing in efficiency, and I believe that it was a beer at Log Tech this past week that said, they want to keep people. It's not about losing people. It's not about adding people. It's about cutting that efficiency to give those people that 30% back so that they can think more strategically. They can focus on strategy. They can focus on creativity. And so I think that, that discussion around these exponential technologies reducing, workforce, I think that there are going to be new jobs coming in, but I also think it's going to be that transition of humans learning to work with machines and being able to give them a lot of time back to be able to benefit the company a little bit more. So I wanted to bring in actually an example. So I just had an AI company on the show, and I want to talk about an example that they gave when it comes to avocados and how the consumer behavior really reflects on supply chain with some of these exponential technologies. So he was saying that there was a shortage of avocados in the US. And so what that did was, and where the data comes in, is that when you have a shortage of something in a store, then you increase the purchase in other areas. So if there's no avocados, maybe they're buying more salsa, maybe they're buying more picante sauce, maybe, there's so many different things that they're doing potentially to make up for the loss of avocados. And so what they were saying is the AI and the data, if you have it right, you're able to already predict those levels. And so you don't end up with empty shelves because of the increase in other parts of the stores. And so I thought that was a pretty interesting concept, because that totally correlated supply chain to product and retail and consumer behavior. What do you think, Barry?
That's the way it will go. And that's what we're starting to understand. The really interesting part about data is we're only touched the surface about how we're going to use it,
yeah,
and how we're going to be meeting consumers' demands in a much, much more efficient way. Mm-hmm. When it comes to the apparel business, what we're looking at is nothing short. When you look at the confluence of what's happening with additive manufacturing, artificial intelligence and machine learning, and real consumer centricity, is the expectation is that we're going to be able to manufacture eventually on a one-to-one basis. Mm-hmm. And that's going to be consumers' expectation. And that will be wildly disruptive to a supply chain that's basically a push model.
Well, on the warehousing side too, right?
I'm sorry?
On the warehousing side too, because at that point in time, you're not going to be carrying finished product inventory. You're going to be carrying raw materials, I believe, right?
One of the real big thinkers in our industry that I really admire a lot is a guy called Richard Kelly from Li & Fung. And they're one of the biggest apparel makers in the world. And he talks very eloquently about this idea, this antiquated model of push. So we anticipate consumer products needs, we make them, we warehouse them, to your point, and we put them in the market and in the anticipation that they will sell. Now, whether it's in a warehouse on a wholesale model or whether it's in a retail store on a fast fashion model, we're still pushing onto the end consumer what we think they want. But with the aggregation of data, with the idea that consumers, there is such a thing as user-generated content and user-generated commerce, that users and influencers will start to create demand for products that we can't understand from a brand perspective.
Right.
That they're going to start to pull from brands the things that they want from us instead. And that completely changes supply chains. And when you get to a company like Unspun in Hong Kong that are working on machines that can digitally weave denim on demand, that they're not there yet, but so they're working on that, so they're scratching at it. Or people like Hong Kong Rita that are really looking at ways to automate the supply chain. Absolutely, and that's all data driven. These are laws of unintended consequences on our industry that we need to anticipate now. And that's the idea and the real value of innovation. Innovation is an interesting area because it can largely be very predictive. And that frustrates people. Nobody wants, look, everybody wants to know the future, but everybody also gets frustrated when you tell them a future that they don't understand when it's going to come or what it'll look and feel like. And the real art of innovation is to move from predictive to prescriptive. Not only this is coming, but here's what you do about it. Yeah. And this is the really interesting things that we can start to think of as when we're thinking about either disruptive elements or things that are self-destructive. Look, we're having a conversation right now on data and how we're just on the bleeding edge of what we even understand data can do. We are only postulating that there are going to be whole new industries that'll be born from the use of data or mirror worlds. So here's something disruptive. My data, my rules. What would happen in California? There's a movement that's called My Data, My Rules. And people are opting out and saying, hey, big tech, I'm not getting anything from this, but you are getting all this information from us. There's this idea that's been out there for a while, the saying, data is the new oil. We don't even know.
And you're giving it away for free, Barry.
Our economies are on data. What would happen if that oil tap turned off?
Yeah.
There are multiple industries that would have multiple holy crap moments if the data was actually turned off. So talk about disruption.
Right.
And that's just it. And that's what we talk about in the industry as in terms of foresight. That's a weak signal. It's very weak.
Right.
And what if we didn't think about those weak signals at all? And we just barreled down the road making buggy whips. Right? That's what the world looks like to me and to us.
Well, and you're giving yours away for free. Now you're making me think about this. I am not going to click allow and I'm not going to click okay because my data, my rules, and you ain't getting it.
My rules.
Well, that kind of takes us into the next and last topic, which was brought up by Audrey. And Audrey, you weren't there, but I was talking about a way to use data and AI to predict other parts of the store's supply chain, right? So if we're lacking in one area, let's say avocados, then consumers are buying more salsa. And so the supply chain needs to know that more salsa needs to be delivered to the stores because we're low on avocados. That's just very a high level view of what I said. But it goes into the fact that transparency in supply chain, which you wanted to talk about, and I'll throw it over to you, but I think that it's going to be critical in being able to manage these stores from various different viewpoints.
Absolutely. And the push now is the transparency in the supply chain because more and more consumers really want to know where their goods are being made, who along the way is handling their goods. And I think with this, kind of new environment where we're all doing our research and we kind of have this data at our fingertips, it means that the customer is starting to kind of get more of a snapshot that, it's not actually, John down the street making my salsa, it's Sarah up here in Milton doing it. So there's definitely a push for this information, and so it's leaning on companies to really start assessing themselves if they understand where their goods are fully coming from.
And
so
who
if you're
they're
using
sorry, go ahead.
and who they're sourcing, who if they've hired company A, but company A actually is a broker and has 6 different kind of, sub companies, or, we do a lot of manufacturing overseas. So we do manufacturing. I mean, over to just manufacturing
Audrey,
everywhere.
I
But,
think those are
is
absolute
it,
table stakes.
Hmm?
I think from an end consumer perspective, those are table stakes now.
Yeah.
I mean,
That it's a must have.
the outdoor industry just had their outdoor retailer show a few weeks ago, and no offense to cat owners, but you couldn't swing a dead cat without finding any and every supplier talking about how many water bottles they used in making their water bottle or their jacket or their sweater or their socks.
Yeah.
And I mean, if you look at the recent announcements, LVMH just announced that they're going to basically purchase carbon offsets for everything. Their plan is everything that they make, so that they are carbon neutral in the next couple of years. And they're just going to pay cash for it. If you look at the Adidas activation on Parlay for the Ocean, which is, I think, one of the biggest, most audacious goals that a large corporation has made in a long time, to say that everything by 2024, everything in their line is going to be made from ocean plastic, from recycled ocean plastics. And the end consumers, they expect it. And the interesting thing is they're rewarded for it. So on the Parlay Ocean for the Oceans activation, they sold 1 million pairs of footwear in a month after they made the announcement that they would make this one collection out of ocean plastics. And it was the activation in every single Adidas store on planet Earth most of last year. It's an incredible initiative that they're getting so much attention, and rightly so, as well as their completely recycled piece of footwear. It's all made from one material so that it can just be thrown back in the bin to be completely recycled. We look at all the work that's happening on the mechanical and chemical recycling side in the apparel industry to address the huge waste and inefficiency that fast fashion has brought. I don't see it being anything other than table stakes for the end consumer.
Well, and I think that that's great. But I think it terrifies most companies. And that's why we haven't seen more transparent supply chains from companies. Because their fear is that they're going to divulge too much information. And if they divulge the wrong information, they're going to be subject to criticism.
And backlash, yeah.
It's the hard one. I mean, there's a conversation about never letting the great be the enemy of the good.
Yeah.
But, if you look at companies like H&M, they had a take-back program last year. They had a sign in their store, and it said, we're going to take back anything that you give us. It's not enough, but we're doing our best. And there is a mea culpa to be had for brands that are on a journey.
Yeah.
And interestingly enough, and consumers will cut you a break if they understand that you're on a journey.
Yeah.
But they won't cut you a break if you're just talking big.
Sure, greenwashing is a big deal. And, we talk about this new generation of people that we wanted to aim at, millennials, Gen X, Gen Y. If they didn't read it on a subreddit, it didn't happen. It doesn't matter whether we can prove that it happened on, by watching Politico or NPR, forget it. If it's not on a subreddit validated by other people, it just didn't happen. This is a highly, highly skeptical generation. And so they can smell that baloney a mile away. And that's why technologies, again, being fueled, go back to Exponential Technologies, but thinking about blockchain and blockchain light and what Amazon has done to make blockchains, even inside of AWS, a reality, a commercial reality, because they've set up a simple AWS blockchain templates. So for $50, you can set up your own chain. This proof, this distributed ledger proof of progeny is really important to get through that subreddit level of skepticism, where people are going to start to use the block more and more for these kinds of things, whether it's organic coffee or organic cotton.
Well, and I also don't just think that it's about the consumer driving it. I think it's also managing risk for business. I think that a transparent supply chain and knowing exactly what's going on at every single turn is, okay, for one, like you said, it's consumer driven, but it also reduced the risks for a business, because then they have a transparent look into the practices that they have, and it can, it touches on legal, it touches on regulatory, right? It's not only just that consumer part of it.
Yeah.
No, I mean, it's making your supply chain more agile.
Really important. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Leah, did you want to weigh in on this one? We've been sort of talking.
No, I think it's going to be a very interesting disruption across the board because empowering consumers, which really is the reason why I think we've all been so willing to share our data, is that's the exchange, has its potential negative repercussions. We see that in a social media swirl when maybe someone's calling out the CEO of a company for a sort of a gray area fault. And I think it changes our definition around ownership. You know, to Barry's earlier example around passing by a store and suddenly you're going to be aware of their, you know, Yelp reviews and table availability, right, et cetera. That removes a lot of control from the business. And so I think that's an evolution of what this tech, exchange looks like, and the transparency in the supply chain, I think, is a tremendous asset, but will be interesting to see how it shapes everything, because there are reverberations through that as well.
Look, I'm going to go back to corporations too. I mean, if you think about this, happened yesterday, okay? 145 CEOs went out on a supposed limb and made a statement about gun action and demanding action on gun violence. That was yesterday. So brands and corporations are becoming, and I would say maybe they're filling a political vacuum where what isn't happening on Capitol Hill does need to happen from a society point of view. And so these ideas around sustainability, around how we treat water, how we treat our planet, how we treat our people, what happens with gun legislation, that's starting to increasingly happen at the corporate level, because it's just not happening fast enough for society to be happy or pleased with what's happening from a legislative perspective.
Yeah, so, but they need to be careful with that, because I saw something, and I believe it was the same yesterday or sometime this week, that consumers are also not buying from brands depending on where they stand politically and what they're going out on a limb for. So
it's interesting to watch that sort of curve of expectation, because typically you'll get a pretty high spike of people saying, I'm not going to buy from large company, let's say Walmart. But then that's all there is around there. And they have their Walmart card. And it's just too easy. Yeah. And they're the recidivism going back to the brand that they're protesting against is also relatively swift. And a Walmart CEO is not going to be unsophisticated about that either, in terms of their breadth and scope, and being not the only game in town, but certainly maybe the easiest game in town to transact with.
Yeah.
Well, and I think
don't lose them permanently.
I think the difference in terms of policy, if we look at a country like China, government sets that, and it's a top-down agenda. And, government owns most of the, business in China in many forms. U.S. company and government approach to supporting, innovation in corporate America has always been led by business. And then government, as it sees things sort of, swell, begins to be able to identify points where it can support, and from a policy standpoint, et cetera. So to me, that's the positive differentiator, because it will require leadership, both from the consumers as advocates and from our businesses.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
It's those protests, though, that the brands really need to be careful of, and that's what they were saying in that, I believe it was a TV segment that I watched, depending on where they go politically or what they're saying, consumers are getting together and boycotting, from a social standpoint that we've never seen before, because they have access to so many people online.
Sarah, I think it's important. It's such an interesting point, but I think we need to have an I am Spartacus moment and just say, honestly, to say, look, this is, and enough is enough. And I applaud the CEOs that are doing this, because it is really important to take a stand, even if there is some diminutive effect on the top line. I do believe they've done the math, and I do believe
fair enough.
Effect is probably relatively temporary, but it's time for the I am Spartacus moment. And I do think that going back to these ideas of these technologies that will fuel the justification behind this, that they can see the data. They can see data from consumer insights, which are much more powerful than we've ever imagined before, based on data. Then we understand where the markets are going and the interaction of those markets well, and we can prove the progeny with it. So there's so much technology that's driving these decisions. Really goes back to the exponential part.
Yeah, and don't get me wrong, that particular subject, I mean, good for them, because somebody needs to stand up and talk about it, because obviously there's too much going on in that sector. And
So
to
to give
your
you a great
point,
example, I can give you a great example. So there's a company in Sweden that's an NGO, and this NGO, they're part of what's called IM, and it's a metal. They make a metal. It's called humanium. And what they do is they take guns from war-torn areas, from bad guys, cartels, kidnappers, war-torn areas, mostly in Central America right now. And what happens is when these guns are seized by the local governments, they are put into warehouses and then they leak back out. And these guns are used again to be able to do bad things again. What this company does, with the help of the UN and the government of Sweden, is to seize these, grind them down, and turn them into a metal, like a 3/16 grade stainless steel. It can be reused like any other stainless steel for anything. You can make it for a kitchen spoon, let's say, but it's made from a gun.
right.
Now, all that is well and good, but it stops there at the NGO level. The NGO can only do so much. And they do this amazing thing. Any money that's made from this is plowed back into the war-torn country.
Wow, that's
Awesome.
great. Yeah.
Except it stops there unless it's put into a consumer product. Unless a brand comes in and activates it and completes that journey to the end consumer that says, this is a cause you care about, this is an idea that you care about, and all of a sudden you can purchase from this brand because you're socially aware, and these are values that the brand has that you have as well. Perfect example with the parlay for the oceans with Adidas. It's the same. Yeah. So Adidas is parlaying for the ocean to connect to the end consumer and connect the dots, because parlay is an NGO.
Well, and I guess
they're not going to sell you anything, right? Well, so it's really the brands that have the power and the CEOs that have the power to bring these social causes to life in our daily lives.
And it also depends on the messaging too, right? I think that's going to be a huge proponent about how that gets parlayed to the consumer level as well. All right. Well, I think that we've had a great discussion so far, but we are going to end this episode a little bit differently. And I think we might be doing this moving forward. We are going to have some supply chain trivia. So Leah, Barry, and Audrey, grab your, I don't know, shakers, your bells, whatever you've got. And I'm going to ask you a question, and then you're going to weigh in and answer. And hopefully we're all going to learn something from this. So the first question is, Panama connects which two bodies of water? Come on, nobody?
You're not going to give us the
Pacific and the
ABC?
Atlantic.
No, that one I don't have.
Pacific
I don't have A, B, and C, and D. Okay, fine. I'll give you A, B, C, and D. So
Barry got it.
What?
Barry got it.
What did you get? What did you say?
Pacific and the Atlantic.
Yes. Ding, 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 ding. All right, next one. And I think I got this wrong last time, because there's not 7 countries in Africa, right?
No, there's like 55 to 59, depending on the time and day.
Well, then, okay. So I have 7 countries that make up the African
in the agreement.
Okay. So what are the 7 countries in the trade agreement in Africa? Who can name those?
That's for AGOA?
I think so, yeah. So South Africa.
Yeah.
Nigeria.
Yeah.
Ethiopia.
Yeah.
Kenya?
Yep.
Benin?
Nope.
Tanzania?
Yep.
Tanzania for sure. Congo?
Yep.
Okay.
Last one.
Last one.
It says Egypt.
Oh, of course.
Yeah.
All right.
So it really covers the whole place.
Yeah, which is awesome. Okay, so now we're going to get into, I'm going to give you options. So with more than 2,000 vessels calling each year, which is the world's largest inland port? A, Montreal, B, Pittsburgh, C, Shanghai, or D, Rotterdam?
I got this
Rotterdam.
time.
Rotterdam.
That's
Shanghai.
last time. It's Montreal.
Ding, 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 ding. 1 point
Really?
for Audrey. If we were keeping score. All right, the next one. What year did the first UPC scan take place? A, 1966, B, 1971, C, 1974, and D, 1982. Barry?
Can I guess 71?
Eh.
Oh, rats. Okay.
Leah?
66?
Eh.
Boy, we're off today.
Audrey? Come on.
It had to have been before I was born. So it's got to be 74.
Ding, 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 ding. All right, next one. The top 2 states for warehousing employment are California with 230,000 jobs and Texas with 178,000 jobs. Which state comes in third place? A, Illinois, B, Georgia, C, New York, or D, Ohio?
Ohio. Everything's in Ohio.
No. Eh.
It is round on the ends and high in the middle, so it's a good guess.
Barry, Leah, Illinois, Georgia, or New York?
I'm going to guess Illinois.
Ding, 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 ding.
All right.
All right. Truck driver slang. What does double nickel stand for? A, a tractor pulling 2 trailers. B, a 55 mile per hour speed limit. Or C, a drive that takes up 2 states. Who's that?
I know this one. It's 55 speed limit. Breaker.
Ding, ding,
right?
ding, ding, ding. So after a round of several questions, we're all leaving winners. Thank you so much for participating in the supply chain trivia.
Sarah.
And I think that concludes it for us for episode 4 of the Trade Squad. Barry, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thanks, Barry.
Yeah.
And to Leah and Audrey, as always, amazing co-hosts. Thanks so much for joining us today as well.
Thanks, Leah. Thanks,
Yay.
Audrey.
I got to run to a meeting, so thanks, you guys.
Bye.
Okay. Next time.